Hello, this video is just a random one about a topic that caught my eye the other day and gives me a chance to talk about something I haven't talked about on this channel in a while, which is Islam and the Middle East. So here's a little background to this story from pathos.com. With hashtag #HangAyazNizami, it's clear that the anti-atheist sentiment in South Asia is getting worse. This story is about a Pakistani blogger who is an atheist called Ayaz Nizami, who was arrested for blasphemy just a few days ago, alongside another blogger. Ayaz Nizami and Rana Noman, two Pakistani atheists, were arrested last week on charges of blasphemy because of things they posted on the Atheist and Agnostic Alliance Pakistan Facebook group and an online forum for the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. Another person is said to have been arrested as well. This came days after government officials asked Facebook and Twitter for help in identifying so-called blasphemers, though neither company has said it would comply with the request. Further, it says the BBC Asian network asked, "What is the right punishment for blasphemy? Tweet at this person with what you think using the hashtag Asian network." And they had to apologize for that. And then on the hashtag #HangAyazNizami, people were saying things like, "He must be dragged in the streets then hanged. Islam is most peaceful religion of world, but when anyone says wrong about our beloved prophet, SAWW, he will be hanged. Inshallah Allah." Most peaceful in the world, but you have to die if you criticize Muhammad. Alright. A terrorist can kill many, but a blasphemous hurt feelings of millions. So hurt feelings mean you have to be killed. By the way, here's my drawing of Muhammad. What do you think? I think it looks quite nice. He looks like a happy man. Look at that. Cherry dude. It's funny because there is a Twitter called #FocusBreak, and he got in some arguments with some people who were pro-hanging these bloggers for criticizing Islam and criticizing Muhammad. And one of the respondents said, "Blasphemy is worse than the Holocaust." Which is very surprising because, I mean, in the Holocaust, 6 million people at least, and a whole bunch of other millions of people died just surrounding that circumstance. But to this guy, being mean about Muhammad is worse than millions and millions of deaths. So I asked him to justify it, and lo and behold, he couldn't. Just that it's bad and it's traitorous to say anything bad about Muhammad. Now, in the past, I watched a lot of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, etc. And I really loved their stuff when I was younger, but as I got older, I kind of moved away from it. And the reason for that is because I felt like they were far too close-minded and antagonistic towards people of different religions. I mean, I'm perfectly fine with being antagonistic towards particular individuals, such as the person that I was tweeting with, who was saying that, you know, blasphemers must die, and I'm sure there would be a sizable chunk of that amount of people in the Middle East and other places in the world who would say such things that I'd be perfectly fine with being antagonistic towards. But the reason I moved away from it with Hitchens and Dawkins and all those kinds of people is because, in my opinion, when it comes to those guys, they could never understand that being antagonistic can only get you so far. And the only thing that really matters in any of these kind of dialogues that people have is what is the personal impact that you are having on the situation? Are you helping to improve it? Now, with people like Sam Harris, it's a mixed bag because, you know, he helps many atheist people get out of the atheist closet and express themselves and feel like they're not quite so smothered by their religiosity and their upbringing. But also his ideas are seen as like imperialistic and justifying torture and war crime and profiling and treating Muslims like shit, which only feeds the terrorist and the ISIS narrative. Because the terrorists love the idea that everybody hates Islam and hates Muslims. That's the kind of thing that they grow on. And the counterpoint to that I always see is you're just infantilizing Muslims. You're treating them like they're just 2 steps away from becoming extremists. We have to handle them with kid gloves, and we can't say offensive things about their religion, and we can't say mean things about them. And to me, that's basically a non-point. It's saying, I'm putting my subjective value judgment that you are infantilizing or treating Muslims with kid gloves onto you. You have to accept that narrative, and therefore say, oh, you're right. Let's just be as offensive and angry and, I guess, hateful as possible against Muslims because there are large, massive problems, as is obvious, with the religion and with Islam generally and in the world. That's an excuse to treat random people like shit because they're Muslims. And I will never buy that narrative. That doesn't make any sense to me. To me, that's just a talking point. I would much rather coddle and infantilize Muslims by not being a massive cuntbag to them, than feed narratives of hate, which just continue forever until nobody can remember who started what, and hatred does drive the aggression and the terrorism. So the thing that the Four Horsemen never understood, at least in my opinion, is it's not necessarily just what ideas you put forth, or how you counter the claims of Islam, or the ways in which you point out that the ideas of Islam are not true, or that the books are backwards, or the problems with Islam in the world. It's not just about that. It's also about the relationship between Islam and other religions, the people within Islam to each other, the relationship of the governments to the citizens, the relationship of countries. It's also about the relationship of individuals. And the guiding star and the guiding principle, at least for me, as someone who thinks of themselves as a progressive, is what is productive, what is useful, what is constructive. If you're just going out there and saying, Islam is backwards, it's wrong, Muslims are savages, they're monsters, look at Pakistan, this is what Islam is, we have to keep them out of our countries, we have to stop them, we have to fight them. What is the outcome of what you are doing and what you were saying? It's just increased aggression, it's increased resentment, and at least, you know, as far as Western countries continue to be in Islamic or Muslim countries, doing their little foreign adventures on those people's soil, that sentiment is going to feed terrorism, and it's going to feed the back and forth between people who are never, in any circumstances, capable of being all right with each other and just accepting who each other is, to the point that terrorism grows rather than diminishes. And that should be the guiding star. What can people do to diminish terrorism? Certainly, the drone wars and killing all the leaders of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth, that has had a positive effect in the short term, in terms of just getting rid of those specific people, but then they get new leaders and they get new recruits and it just goes around in a cycle. So the guiding star should be, how do you reduce their recruitment? How do you make ISIS and Al-Qaeda smaller? How do you make Muslims read the book, the Quran, that they will not throw away and they won't get rid of no matter what you fucking do? How do you make them read it in a way that makes them less likely to be intolerant towards people who are not Muslims? That's the only thing that matters. There's some talking points about, you know, infantilizing or coddling Muslims, but that's not a counter to whether you should be pro-profiling. You should shut down the borders and treat them like second-class citizens, or try to avoid having any of them as citizens at all, and treat them with contempt all the time on media, and have these like foreign wars and adventures. Until the West can take some sort of responsibility, not specifically for the terrorism occurring, that's on the terrorists, but for not doing anything to help diminish it. There's always going to be some kind of terrorism, there's always going to be loonies, there's always going to be people who are going to commit acts of violence. But the people who can have any influence on how much violence and who is doing it, etc., they have to do their best to make sure it's as little as possible. And that is not the current trajectory that we're on. Terrorism is only increasing, xenophobia is increasing, racism is increasing, hatred and bigotry are increasing. And fascist right-wingers are doing absolutely nothing to diminish terrorism or slow it down. They're just taking advantage of how unsettled the situation is. Now, why do I bring all of that up in relation to this Pakistan blogger situation? Because when I watched the Four Horsemen, after a bunch of years of watching their stuff, eventually, when they started talking, it was just like, I know Islam is backwards. I know that it's superstition. I know that it's wrong. I know that it's stupid. I know that it's misogynistic. I know that it's anti-science. I know that it's anti-woman. I know that the majority of the countries in the world that have Islam integrated with their governments, which shouldn't even happen because I believe in the separation of church and state for good reason, because you need a secular government not based on superstitions. I know that those countries fucking suck when they beat the shit out of people with whips for blaspheming, and they arrest bloggers and they force women to cover their faces, and it's patriarchal and it's misogynistic. I know, but what do you do about it? And the only thing they could ever come up with was the war of ideas. And then in this war of ideas, they say we should profile, and we should do drone wars, and we should invade, and we should police the world, and we should treat them with contempt and disgust, you know, the general Muslim population, and we should conflate them with terrorists by only talking about them in relation to terrorists, and we should etc. and so forth. Which doesn't justify any terrorism or violence against you. If you provocate someone and they kill you, it's their fault for killing you. But at the same time, if we're dealing with a global situation, less provocation can only be a positive. It can only be a good thing. Now, I had to add all of that because I want to make the way that I actually think about this issue clear, and what differentiates me between like new atheist types and atheists who still think that it's so cool that they're an atheist.
Religion is bad. Do we really need to go over this? Just the idea that people actually believe these things is insane. And you should find them insane, Greg. You should find them insulting to humanity's collective intellect. I wonder why you think this way, Greg. This is just his pathetic virtue signaling. I'm one of the good atheists. I'm one of the nice ones. Face it, Greg, you're a fucking porch atheist. Guys, I'm an atheist. I don't really believe, but if you believe, that's fine. I'm not going to judge you. I think that's totally cool. You have outed yourself as not an anti-theist and therefore a pussy.
And that makes them more intelligent and better than other people, when it fucking doesn't, because a lot of atheists I talk to online are morons. No offense to you people. And also because that's generally what this dialogue comes back to, and it's inescapable, and it's always going to come back to that. Talking about all Muslims in relation to terrible things that Muslims do, often in the name of Islam. There is always going to be that extra chunk of Muslims who are going to come up because they get kind of bundled in with these kind of events. But when it comes to entire countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, etc., they are theocracies. Absolutely. And they're fucking shitholes. And they need total secular reform from the bottom up. But that's not going to be possible while these countries are continually fighting the West and trying to force their citizens to become more religious because they think that Islam is basically put upon. Like the psychotic person that I talked to on Twitter said that you cannot criticize Muhammad, and that was it. Like, you just cannot say anything about him, you can't criticize him. I ask why? Because it's traitorous to God. That kind of mentality has to be worked out of. People have to get worked out of that kind of extremism. And the only way to really do that is through a tolerant secularism, which is appealing, which doesn't provide a threat to other thought patterns, but it's just something that people can willingly choose because it's so appealing. Not one which is just preaching intolerantly in the reverse direction, and it's obviously not as extreme and it's not as bad as Islam. It's not comparable, but diminishing this kind of extremist thought should be the guiding star. That should be the only thing that actually matters to people, and it's not the only thing that matters to people. It seems that just talking shit is a lot more important to people. Because, I mean, I can't do anything about these bloggers. I can just say that it's fucking disgusting and it's wrong, and a theocracy is the worst kind of government, and in Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries, they're always committing these kind of atrocities. But I can't do anything about it from my perspective except say we need a better alternative. We need a scientific, secular, humanist alternative that people will want to turn to. And that cannot be tethered to being anti-Islam. It just can't, because it's not going to work unless we just kill everybody, but that sounds like a drag. And not long ago I was being called a regressive because that was the popular phrase of the moment, but my views on this have never changed and they're still the same. And none of the atheistic preaching by the new atheists has had any impact on my point of view when it comes to this issue, which is basically that we have to do what we can to be productive and to be useful and to diminish and reduce terrorism and extremism in the world. But maybe there's not that much we can do. We can just be outraged and say it's wrong and try to provide help to people who are negatively impacted by it, such as these bloggers who are going to get murdered with the love of lots of people. I mean, at the very least, it's good that Facebook and Twitter have not complied with these governments saying that they want to kill these people, and they shouldn't. We don't favor Islam, and we don't favor particular nations trying to force us to give up people so they can fucking murder them. That would be ridiculous. And the idea that Islam is a religion of peace, I mean, that's fucking silly. Islam and Christianity and other religions, they're not peaceful at all. They're not peaceful religions. They're very violent, and they have long histories of violence. But it's just a question of where they are now. And currently, these particular countries, yeah, they are hotbeds of extremism, hatred, misogyny, patriarchy, you name it. All of these terrible things. But it's a matter of like how the religion plays out in the real world. And if it's playing out like a fucking disaster, then we need to do something about it. But we shouldn't do things that haven't worked, like start wars. Or refuse to come to the table when it comes to the Israel-Palestine situation, because Israel just keeps holding up its nose and saying, you know, you did this, you did that, you did this, you fired a rocket, you did this, you fired that rocket, you know, we live in terror from you. So basically, it's never, ever, ever gonna get better. I would just say, you know, fuck extremists who don't want to work with us. We want to work with anybody in Palestine who wants to solve this situation. And there are people in Palestine who want to solve the situation, but they're just being ignored because they only ever focus on the extremists and the terrorists. They don't focus on the thing that really matters, which is how do you make the situation better? How do you improve it? What can you do to make it a better situation? And sitting there and folding your arms and just saying, they did this, they did that, that's never going to fix anything ever. It doesn't work on the internet when you're having arguments. They did this a year ago. You did this 2 years ago. You know, people just hold on to these grievances. That's all it is, one long grievance going back into history. The only way to move on is to get over that. And atheists have to get over a lot of their grievances about Muslims, not the religion, not the ideas in it, which none of us think is true, and I'm an atheist myself and I don't believe in God. They don't have to get over that. They have to get over this conflation of random Muslims with terrorists. They are much too flippant about it and it doesn't help. It's not useful. It's counterproductive. You can give me all the shit you want, say, we gotta be real. Feels not reals. We're gonna say, hey, your religion's evil, you're bad, you've done it, it's your fault, you've gotta call it out, we gotta hear from you. But the only thing that they're hearing coming back the other way is intolerance, judgment, intolerance, judgment, intolerance, intolerance. That's not necessarily gonna turn them into a terrorist overnight, but they are gonna say, well, fuck these people. And it's gonna make them more vulnerable to being preyed upon by extremists. So we have to cut out that shit. And what do Muslims have to do? Well, I don't fucking know, because that's the problem that we're having. Muslims are doing things and we can't control, we can only influence. We have to influence in a positive direction, but we need to stop being so caustic and negative and hateful, because that just goes around, it goes back and forth, and it doesn't really matter who was justified by what, whose fault it is to do with this or that. It only really matters how we approach the situation. So apologies, this has been an extremely rambling video. Obviously, in conclusion, what is happening in Pakistan is fucking hideous. This kind of shit just goes on and on and on. But I refuse to be a kind of reactionary who just starts going on angry rants about Muslims and Islam. I would much rather contribute how I can in a positive fashion and try to encourage people to be more positive. I know that terrorists are going to exist and terrorists are going to continue doing what they do, and it doesn't matter what I fucking say about that. But we need a kind of attitude shift in the West and in atheists, in my personal opinion, which says no matter our personal feelings about your beliefs, what we care about is moving forward. What we care about is taking the next step. What we care about is diminishing the bad and playing up the good. And we are willing to accept anything about you which is positive and which is good. And the things which are bad, we are going to discourage. But we're not going to do so by just calling you a cunt and doing everything we can to antagonize you, because it's not working. And I think that is the attitude that I would love to see, but it's not the attitude that we've got.